I was recently revisiting a recording of a debate held at a private Christian university, and one moment stood out before the opening statements even began. The host turned to the audience and, with a slightly nervous grin, said, "I'm sure Mr. Hitchens will survive the evening." There was a polite, tense ripple of laughter. Hitchens himself just sat there looking entirely unbothered, the posture of a man who had spent his career in literal war zones and felt more at home in a conflict than in a consensus. Most people in that room expected the usual new atheist talking points, arguments about carbon dating or the logic of the Big Bang. But that's where the turn happened. Hitchens wasn't interested in a polite disagreement over metaphysics. He had just released a book that left even some of his secular colleagues feeling uneasy. An expose where he essentially pulled the veil off Mother Teresa. While the world saw a saint of the gutters, Hitchens described a woman who glorified suffering rather than soul-soothing, acting as a high-profile agent for a much larger, much older power. What was striking was his tone, a cold, journalistic detachment. He didn't talk about the Catholic Church as a community of the faithful. He spoke of it as a transnational corporation, with a unique, dangerous ability to convert private belief into durable, unaccountable power. He started drawing lines between ancient dogmas and 20th century dictators, suggesting that the church hadn't just survived history's darkest moments, but had occasionally negotiated them to secure its own influence. He wasn't just arguing that the religion was wrong, he was arguing that its very infrastructure was a civilizational risk. That shift from criticizing a set of beliefs to accusing a global institution of providing the intellectual framework for barbarism is what made his perspective so uniquely incendiary. It leaves you wondering, if an organization claims a monopoly on morality while operating outside the reach of democratic law, is it a source of stability, or is it, as Hitchens claimed, something far more poisonous? That opening text really, it just perfectly sets the table for what we need to get into today. Because, usually when you talk about Christopher Hitchens, the conversation gets stuck.
It does. It gets stuck on theology, right?
Exactly. We end up debating, the existence of God or the flood or whatever. But when you look at the stack of sources we have here, the articles, the sociological studies, these debate transcripts, it becomes so clear that he wasn't really just critiquing a religion.
No, not at all. He was, I think, critiquing a mechanism of power.
Yes, a blueprint. That's the word. A blueprint for how these huge, unchecked institutions protect themselves,
right,
often at the expense of, human honesty.
And that's the core of our deep dive today. That's the crucial distinction. Hitchens saw a pattern. He identified a very specific way that large, powerful institutions operate to ensure their own survival above all else. And his point, which was so controversial, was that it didn't matter if that institution was spiritual, like the Vatican, or secular.
Like a modern university or a huge corporation.
Precisely. Or even a political movement. The mechanism, the survival instinct, it remains eerily the same. Protect the structure, no matter the cost.
So the mission for us today is to really test that theory. We're going to take Hitchens' specific charges against the Catholic Church, and we're zeroing in on three big ones. Institutional survivalism, this idea of vicarious redemption, and the ethics of suffering. And we're going to see if you can map them onto the modern sociological landscape.
To see if they fit.
To see if that intellectual framework for barbarism he talked about has, migrated from the cathedral to the campus, to the corporation, to the public square.
It's a fascinating project. We're essentially applying a theological critique to a secular world. And to do that, you're right, we are weaving together some pretty heavy sources.
We really are.
On the one hand, you have the theological and historical side. So we're pulling from Hitchens' own work, obviously God is not great, the missionary position, and also his debates about the church's relationship with 20th century dictators.
And the abuse crisis data, which is just chilling.
Absolutely. And then on the other side, the sociological side, we have things like Campus Culture Wars by Campbell and Manning, which is all about victimhood culture.
A key text for this.
A very key text. Then there's We're Nearly All Victims Now, which looks at identity politics versus liberalism. And finally, Antonia Darger's work, Unveiling the Myth of Meritocracy, which is a deep critique of our success narratives.
It's a really unique combination of material. So let's just dive right in. Let's start with that first pillar Hitchens identified, institutional survivalism. The idea that the institution, the structure itself, is more important than the truth it's supposed to uphold. And to really frame this, I want to start with a story, a modern one. I was scrolling through some archives recently, and I came across a narrative that felt like a ghost haunting our modern headlines. Try to imagine a high-ranking administrator at a prestigious European university today, a man named Julian, who finds himself sitting in a mahogany-paneled room, much like the clerics of the 1930s. He's looking at a report of gross misconduct by a major donor, a man whose wealth sustains the university's very existence. Julian knows that exposing the truth would uphold the objective standards the university claims to represent, yet he feels the heavy weight of the institution pressing down on him. I heard that he ultimately chose to bury the report, justifying it as preserving the sanctuary of education for future generations. This is the exact survivalist logic Hitchens identified in the historical church. The belief that the institution is so holy or so necessary that its survival justifies the sacrifice of the truth itself. Watching this, I felt a profound sense of sadness. While I understand the desperate need to keep our cultural cathedrals standing in uncertain times, we have to ask ourselves, if we burn the truth to keep the building warm, what exactly are we preserving? We are seeing elite institutions today become secular churches, protecting their brand at the cost of the social trust that once made them legitimate. That story about Julian, it gives me a chill because it feels so plausible. It's not some grand conspiracy, it's just a quiet decision made in a nice room.
And that's the horror of it. It's mundane. But that decision to bury the truth, to save the structure, that is precisely what Hitchens was screaming about when he looked at the history of the Vatican.
So this is his argument writ large.
It's the Julian story played out on the stage of world history. I mean, you have to get your head around how Hitchens saw the church. For him, it was never just a community of believers. That was secondary. He defined it as, and this is his term, a transnational corporation.
A political entity first.
A political entity first and foremost. And his core critique was this. When an institution starts to believe that it is the sole vehicle for salvation, or in Julian's case, the sole vehicle for education or progress,
right,
then its own survival becomes the highest possible moral good. It becomes more important than the very ethics that institution claims to preach.
And he pointed to the 20th century as Exhibit A for this. We're not just talking about, financial scandals. We're talking about direct dealings with fascism.
This is where his argument gets really sharp and where we have to look at the actual treaties. He brought this up constantly. The Reichskonkordat of 1933.
Okay, break that down for us.
It was a treaty, an agreement, signed between the Vatican and Nazi Germany. Now, just think about the timing. This is 1933. Hitler has just become chancellor. The regime is still cementing its power. It's looking for legitimacy on the world stage.
And the Vatican gave it to them.
Hitchens' argument was, yes, they did. They were one of the very first international bodies to officially recognize the Nazi government. And what did they get in return? What was the trade?
That's the key question.
Well, he argued the church traded away its moral legitimacy for institutional guarantees. They got promises from the Nazis that the state wouldn't interfere with Catholic education in Germany. They got their property rights respected. They secured their assets.
So it was a protection racket, essentially. We will give you the moral cover of our recognition, and you promise not to touch our schools and our buildings.
That's precisely how Hitchens framed it. It was a pragmatic corporate decision to secure the infrastructure of the institution. But the cost, my God, the cost was the normalization of a barbaric regime right at its inception.
And this wasn't a one-off event.
Not at all. He would point to the Lateran Treaty in 1929 with Mussolini. That treaty is what actually created the Vatican City as a sovereign state. It was a deal, a negotiation with a fascist dictator to secure temporal earthly power.
So they get their own country, basically.
They get their own country. In exchange for what? For staying out of Italian politics, for giving Mussolini's regime a free hand. He also pointed to the Ustasha in Croatia during World War II. This was a brutal Nazi puppet regime, deeply, deeply Catholic in its identity, where there was significant documented clerical collaboration and genocide.
Now, to be fair, the argument isn't that every single priest was a fascist, right?
Yeah. Of course not. And Hitchens was careful to say that. There were brave priests who resisted. But his critique was not about individuals. It was about the institution, the central command in Rome. And his point was that when the institution was pushed, when its survival was on the line, it consistently chose to prioritize its own power, its own influence, its own real estate over a clear, unambiguous denunciation of pure evil.
Which draws a terrifyingly straight line from those huge geopolitical deals in the 30s and 40s to the abuse crisis in the 80s and 90s.
It's the exact same survivalist reflex. It's the same mechanism, just turned inward.
How so?
Well, when you look at the source material on this, especially the document called Crimen Solicitationis.
Right, the 1962 document.
Exactly, a 1962 instruction from the Holy Office, which later became the CDF. Critics, including Hitchens, but also legal experts like attorney Daniel Shea, they argued that this document wasn't just about internal procedure. They argued it was a blueprint for a conspiracy.
A conspiracy to do what?
To mandate secrecy. It laid out strict rules under threat of excommunication for how to handle allegations of priests using the confessional for sexual solicitation. And the entire process was designed to be handled internally under the pontifical secret. It was designed to keep it out of the hands of secular law enforcement.
So if you talk about this outside the church, you are attacking the church itself. You are the one committing the sin.
You're breaking a sacred vow. And you see the result of that mindset play out for decades. What did the Boston Globe Spotlight team uncover? What did we see in Ireland and Australia, all over the world? The standard operating procedure was not to call the police. It was to move the accused priest.
To another parish.
To another parish, where he would have access to more children. And the driving motivation was what? Avoiding scandal. It was brand management. They were protecting the image, the brand of the church, because in their worldview, the church is the sole vessel for salvation. If the institution looks bad, if people lose faith in it, souls are lost. Therefore, hiding a crime, burying the truth, can be twisted into a holy act of institutional protection.
The sources also point out a really insidious psychological ploy here, which was treating abuse as a spiritual problem, not a crime.
Yes, that was key. The framing was everything. They would send these priests to so-called treatment centers, like the St. Luke Institute in Maryland. The idea was that the abuser was sick or was suffering from a, quote, spiritual ailment that could be prayed away or treated internally by other priests.
Which completely bypasses the entire legal system.
It bypasses and supersedes it. It sends the message that the institution is above the law of the land. It has its own jurisdiction, its own courts, its own methods of healing that are superior to secular justice.
And this is where the parallel to our friend Julian and the modern secular institutions becomes. I mean, it's just impossible to ignore.
It's a one-to-one comparison.
You just swap the words out. You replace priest with tenured star professor or rainmaking CEO. You replace St. Luke Institute with a quiet internal HR investigation or a non-disclosure agreement. It is the same picture.
It is the modern parallel. We see these secular churches, universities, NGOs, massive tech companies. They act with the same sense of divine mission. They believe their work is so vital, whether it's educating the next generation or connecting the world or curing cancer, that they can justify suppressing inconvenient truths to protect that mission.
So a scandal isn't a moment for justice and transparency.
No, it's a PR crisis to be managed. It's a threat to the brand. And just like Julian, they bury the report to save the sanctuary. And in doing so, they are replicating step by step the exact framework for barbarism that Hitchens was warning us about 50 years ago.
It's an incredibly powerful connection, and it leads us directly to the second major pillar of his critique. Because if the first pillar is about how the institution protects its physical body, its structure, then the second is about how it manages its soul, or more specifically, its guilt.
Yes. Vicarious redemption.
Hitchens had a visceral, almost physical hatred for this concept.
He found it morally repulsive, the idea that someone else, anyone else, can pay your debt. It drove him mad.
And again, before we dig into the theology of it, I want to bring in another modern story from our research that shows how this idea, this outsourcing of guilt, has seeped into our everyday lives, especially our work lives. I saw a video essay recently about a young professional in London named Sarah, working in a corporate environment that had replaced traditional performance reviews with collective accountability sessions. Try to imagine Sarah's confusion when a senior lead made a catastrophic error that cost the team months of work, only for the leadership to frame it through a lens of shared systemic burden. In this world, no one is ever truly at fault because the guilt is outsourced to the environment or the process. It reminded me so much of the theological concept of vicarious redemption, the idea that someone else can pay for your moral debts. I heard that Sarah eventually quit because she felt her own hard work and merit were being dissolved into a soup of collective excuses. Reading her story, I couldn't help but feel the weight of what we're losing. Mercy is a beautiful thing, and we should always strive to understand the pressures people face. But when we outsource guilt entirely, we also outsource our agency. If no one is responsible for failure, then no one can truly be responsible for success. We are witnessing the collapse of meritocracy into a system where redemption is a corporate buzzword used to avoid the uncomfortable work of personal growth, dissolved into a soup of collective excuses. That phrase, it really sticks with you because it feels so familiar.
It's so familiar, and it connects directly to why Hitchens used a word like immoral to describe the doctrine of vicarious redemption. For him, this wasn't an abstract theological point. It was a profound ethical failing. He often described it as scapegoating.
Right. He traced it all the way back to the Old Testament.
He did. He traced it back to the ancient practice of literally, physically loading the sins of the village onto a goat and then driving that goat into the desert to die. The village is now clean, but has anything actually been solved? Has anyone learned anything?
So his problem wasn't just that it was, supernatural or scientifically impossible. His problem was that it was ethically wrong.
That was the core of it. For him, it was a moral hazard. Hitchens would argue, okay, let's say I commit a crime. I harm someone, and you, out of kindness, step in and take the punishment for me. You go to jail for my crime. Is the slate actually clean? Is justice served? The person I harmed is still harmed. The flaw in my character that led me to commit the crime is still there. I haven't learned. I haven't made restitution. Nothing has been resolved. He argued it deprives the individual of their integrity, of the difficult but necessary work of facing their own failings.
He also called it a form of, what was the term, celestial dictatorship.
Yes, that was another one of his brilliant, venomous phrases. He saw it as a form of divine coercion. The narrative is, I, God, sent my son to die for your sins, which you have from birth, even though you didn't ask me to, and now you owe me everything. You owe me your eternal gratitude and obedience.
It's a compulsory gratitude for a gift you never requested.
Exactly. And that compulsory gratitude absolves you of the hard work of actual day-to-day ethical behavior. You don't have to fix your own mess because someone else already cleaned it up. Jesus paid it all, so I don't have to carry the weight of my own actions. I just have to be grateful.
And this is where the sociological pivot in our sources gets so interesting, because we're seeing this same mechanism, this same outsourcing of responsibility in what Antonia Darder's work calls the myth of meritocracy.
It's a fascinating and counterintuitive link.
It really is, because on the surface, they seem like total opposites. One is about grace and unearned forgiveness. The other's about earning everything you get.
That's the sales pitch for meritocracy. You get what you earn. But Darder's argument, and I think Hitchens would have appreciated the structural critique here, is that the myth of meritocracy in our neoliberal world functions just like a religion. It serves to mask the real operations of power.
How so?
Well, the modern story we're told is that the market is this objective, almost natural force. The market decides who succeeds and who fails. If you're a billionaire, it's because you have merit. You're smarter, you worked harder. If you're in poverty, it's because you lack merit.
The market becomes the new god. An invisible hand that dispenses a judgment you can't question.
Perfectly put. Darder argues that meritocracy acts as a hegemonic tool, to use the Gramscian term. It makes the existing power structure seem natural and just. It claims that success is just the result of spontaneous individual talent and effort, which completely masks the enormous roles of inherited wealth, class, race, and gender. It's a form of what Marxists would call false consciousness.
You believe the game is fair, so you never question the rules of the game.
You never question the rules, and the source specifically brings up Elon Musk as an example of this.
Right. How does he fit into this?
Darder uses Musk as the archetype. He is postured in our culture as the ultimate meritocratic genius, the self-made man changing the world through sheer brilliance. But the argument from this perspective is that he holds this immense power dominion over global communication, data, the destiny of space travel, not just because of his qualifications, but because of a system that allows for and rewards massive, almost feudal-level wealth accumulation. The system treats that wealth as merit. The success validates itself.
And then in Sarah's story, in that corporate environment, we see the flip side. When things go wrong inside these massive systems, the responsibility is suddenly dissolved.
That's the great paradox, isn't it? On the one hand, the system tells the individual at the bottom, you are 100% responsible for your own poverty. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. But on the other hand, inside the corporate machine, when a senior executive makes a billion-dollar mistake, it's suddenly framed as a systemic issue.
It becomes unforeseen market forces or a collective systemic burden.
It's the same mechanism of evasion. Just as the sinner in some theological frameworks might say, the devil made me do it, or it's all part of God's mysterious plan, the corporate bureaucrat says, it was a process failure. The individual is erased.
Both systems then effectively stop the individual from confronting the reality of their own actions.
Yes. Darder in her work references the educator Paula Freire and his concept of the banking model of education. Ferrer argued that traditional education treats students like empty bank accounts. The teacher just makes deposits of information. The student is a passive vessel to be filled, a commodity to be processed, rather than a critical agent who co-creates knowledge.
And this mirrors the religious demand for submission.
It mirrors the demand for submission over critical thought. So whether it's vicarious redemption telling you Christ already solved your moral problem for you, or neoliberal meritocracy telling you the market has already decided your value for you, the end result is identical. The erosion of true individual agency. You are convinced that you're not really a player in the game, you're just a piece being moved around on the board.
Which is a deeply disempowering place to be. And that leads us to the third and honestly probably the most controversial pillar of Hitchens' critique. If the institution protects itself at all costs, and if guilt is outsourced and dissolved, what happens to the human suffering that's left over?
This is where he went after Mother Teresa. And this is where, even today, people get very, very uncomfortable.
I can imagine. But before we unpack his specific theological critique, let's look again at the modern landscape. Because the way our culture deals with suffering and victimhood has undergone a seismic shift. I was reading a series of blog posts from a community organizer in a mid-sized American city, and he described a neighborhood meeting that felt like a window into the ethics of suffering Hitchens warned about. Try to imagine a room full of people trying to fix a broken park. Instead of discussing drainage or playground equipment, the meeting devolved into a hierarchy of who had suffered more under the city's previous administrations. The truth of the park's condition was secondary to the performance of victimhood. I heard that the project was eventually abandoned because the stakeholders couldn't agree on whose historical trauma took precedence in the planning committee. It's a sociological shift where pain has become the only valid currency for social power. Looking at this, I feel a deep empathy for those who've been marginalized. Their pain is real and deserves recognition. However, as I see these narratives play out, I worry we are building a functional social ecosystem on a foundation of competitive grievances rather than rational problem solving. We've institutionalized the idea that suffering grants an automatic moral authority, which ironically often prevents us from actually healing the very things that cause the suffering in the first place. Pain has become the only valid currency for social power. That's a heavy statement and a really challenging one.
It's incredibly challenging, but it maps so perfectly onto Hitchens' central critique in the missionary position. His argument was never that Mother Teresa was lazy or that she didn't work hard. His argument was about her goal.
He claimed her goal wasn't to end poverty.
It was to sanctify it, to glorify it. He pointed out that her famous clinics in Calcutta were not, by and large, medical facilities designed to cure people. They were hospices, places for the destitute to die. He wrote about the poor hygiene, the lack of proper painkillers, the refusal to send treatable cases to actual hospitals.
Because in her theology, suffering was a good thing.
It was a gift. That was his core charge. Her theology held that suffering and pain brought the poor closer to the passion of Christ. He famously quoted her telling a man dying in agony from cancer that his pain was Jesus kissing him.
To which Hitchens, in his classic style, apparently replied, "Well, I'd tell him to stop kissing me."
Exactly. And beyond the black humor of it, Hitchens saw this as a sinister tool of social control. If you can convince the poor and the oppressed that their suffering is holy, that it's a blessing, then they won't revolt against the political and economic order that keeps them in misery. They'll submit to it. They'll embrace it.
But what's so strange is that in the park story, and in our modern culture more broadly, the dynamic seems to have completely inverted. Suffering isn't keeping people quiet and submissive. It's the loudest, most powerful thing in the room.
It is a fascinating inversion, and to understand it, we have to bring in the sociologists Campbell and Manning. Their work on moral cultures is essential here. They argue that Western society has gone through 3 distinct phases.
Okay, what are they?
So first, for centuries, we had what they call an honor culture. Think of aristocratic dueling or the American Wild West. In an honor culture, your reputation is everything. It's paramount. If you are insulted or slighted, you must retaliate, often violently, to prove your strength and reclaim your honor.
And in that culture, being a victim is shameful.
It's the ultimate shame. It means you are weak, that you were unable to defend yourself, so you hide it. Then, they argue, starting around the 18th and 19th centuries, we moved into a dignity culture.
This is the liberal ideal, right?
Yes. This is the world of sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. In a dignity culture, your worth is inherent. It's internal. You have a thick skin. If someone insults you, You ignore it or deal with it privately because you know your own worth and you don't need their validation.
And now, where are we now?
Campbell and Manning argue we are rapidly entering a third phase, victimhood culture, and it combines elements of the other two in a very strange way.
Oh, so.
In a victimhood culture, you have the high sensitivity to slights that you see in an honor culture. People are very attuned to being offended. But, and this is the crucial difference, you don't retaliate yourself. You appeal to a third party, to a higher authority.
The university administration, the corporate HR department, the court of public opinion on social media.
Precisely. High sensitivity to slights, combined with a heavy reliance on authority to resolve the conflict. And in this new moral framework, your moral status, your power, is conferred not by your strength or your dignity, but by how much you have suffered. The victim becomes the most morally pure figure in the room.
This explains the focus on microaggressions.
It explains it perfectly. From their perspective, a microaggression complaint is not just about someone being rude. It's a public performance. It's an act of declaring one's victimization to gain moral authority and, crucially, to mobilize the institutional authorities against the alleged offender.
The sources cite a few specific examples of this. The Maximum Mexican Party at Clemson University, or this emerging language of sweat shaming or body shaming in places like gyms.
Right. These are all instances where a perceived slight, whether it was intended or not, triggers a massive institutional response. And you see it at the highest levels. The number of university presidents who have been forced to resign over claims of insufficient action regarding offensive slurs or protest is staggering. The internal logic is, I am suffering, my pain is my proof, therefore I have the moral high ground, and the institution has a sacred duty to intervene and protect me from harm.
And this ties directly into the Civitas source we have, which discusses the rise of identity politics.
A direct link. The Civitas argument is that this represents a fundamental departure from classical liberalism. Liberalism, in the tradition of Martin Luther King Jr., judges individuals by the content of their character, things they can control, the choices they make.
But identity politics doesn't.
It judges people by their ascribed characteristics, the things they can't change, their race, their gender, their sexuality, their ancestry. And it creates a hierarchy based on which groups are considered to have suffered the most historically.
The source uses a reference to Animal Farm, which is pretty pointed. All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others.
It calls this an Orwellian turn. The argument in the source is that once a group achieves official recognition as a victim group, they can, ironically, sometimes become aggressors in the name of their own self-defense. The source mentions a concept called vindictive protectiveness, which comes from the work of Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff.
What does that mean?
It's the drive to create safe spaces and protect people from any and all emotional discomfort. But the unintended consequence is that it creates what they call a moral dependence. People become dependent on the authorities to manage their emotional lives for them.
Which, my God, that brings us right back to Christopher Hitchens in his critique of the church.
It's a perfect circle.
His biggest charge against religion was that it infantilized people. It treated them like children who needed to be guided. The flock, led by the shepherd.
And here we are in our most elite secular institutions, our universities, creating a culture where adults are increasingly treated as fragile children who need constant protection from words, ideas, and emotional distress, all managed by a benevolent priest-like administration.
We've just swapped out the priest for the diversity, equity, and inclusion dean.
But the underlying structure of dependency is exactly the same.
So if we pull all three of these threads together, we have the church of the university protecting its own brand above the truth, which is institutional survivalism.
Check.
We have the corporate confessional, where no one is ever at fault because guilt is outsourced to the system, which is vicarious redemption.
Check.
And we have the sainthood of the victim, where suffering is no longer something to be alleviated, but something to be performed to gain power, which is the new ethics of suffering.
It's a perfect, if terrifying, convergence. We have, in many ways, secularized the very pathologies that Hitchens spent his life warning us about in their religious form.
Okay, let's try and bring this all home. The mission of this deep dive was to see if that framework for barbarism that Hitchens identified in the church have actually migrated to the secular world. After going through all this, what's the verdict?
I think the verdict has to be a pretty resounding yes. Let's just walk through it one last time. Point 1. Hitchens warned us about powerful institutions that claim a monopoly on morality in order to protect their own power. We saw this in the Vatican's historical treaties with dictators and its handling of the abuse crisis. And we see its echo today in the story of Julian at the university, burying a difficult truth to protect the brand.
It's the same survivalist reflex.
Exactly. Point 2. Hitchens warned against the moral hazard of vicarious redemption, the outsourcing of personal responsibility, the idea that someone or something else can pay your debts. We see that today in the story of Sarah at the corporation, and in the broader myth of meritocracy, where vague, impersonal systems replace any sense of real individual accountability.
The system is to blame, so no one is to blame.
And point 3. Hitchens warned, most controversially, against the glorification and weaponization of suffering. He saw it in Mother Teresa's work, and we see a new version of it in the Park Meeting story and the sociological rise of victimhood culture, where pain is no longer just a private experience, but has become the primary public currency for moral and political power.
It's a really sobering realization. We, in the modern West, we often congratulate ourselves on being a post-religious society. We think we've outgrown the superstitions and dogmas of the past.
We think we're so much more rational.
Right. But if we have simply taken those same ancient structures, institutional infallibility, the outsourcing of guilt, the sanctification of suffering, and transferred them into our HR manuals, our campus bylaws, and our corporate mission statements, have we really moved forward at all?
Or have we just built a new Vatican, but with different brick and mortar?
That's the question. It leaves you with this final, really provocative thought. It seems we've rejected the celestial dictatorship of the old church with its popes and its commandments. But in its place, we may have just built a new secular Vatican out of HR policies and university speech codes. It makes you wonder if we've actually liberated ourselves at all, or if we've just found a more modern way to be unfree.